Today, we debriefed this critical incident, which we do for all critical incidents. And I do have some answers for questions that I think the public still has. I am going to give you what I know. I, again, have made a difficult decision in doing this because the case is not closed, and therefore I am speaking to you regarding facts that I know to date. But I do think that it is information that would help bring closure to everyone involved. So these are the points that I can share with you today. As you know, we received a call about a man on the bridge at about 7:20 p.m. Friday evening. The first officer on the scene quickly determined that he was suicidal, and the command decision was to close the bridge and call out for negotiators. All members of our negotiation team are specially trained and certified, and they are especially trained with negotiating with suicidal people. The commander of our negotiation team has been on the team for 27 years. And among our negotiators, we also had an FBI negotiator with us. The subject, Mr. Levy, had a very extensive mental illness record and had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic with a personality disorder and substance abuse. He had made several suicide attempts and had indeed jumped from 3 other bridges. He had been taken into physical custody against his will, which is called an involuntary commitment, on all of his attempts that we know about. He had just been released from Western State Mental Hospital on the 24th, 3 days before this event, from another suicide attempt by a doctor who released him, who deemed he was stable. The doctor gave him medications and told him to get into outpatient services at Spokane Mental Health. It took about 5 hours for our negotiators to even identify who he was, because he wouldn't say much. Once he was identified and we learned that he had jumped from other bridges, one of our negotiators was able to make personal contact with an officer who was a negotiator on one of the times Mr. Levy did jump from a bridge. This officer told our negotiators to be very careful because Mr. Levy knew about our police tactics, such as uses of tasers, pepper spray, because he had been taken into involuntary protective custody so many times. Most importantly, this negotiator told us that on one occasion they had worked out a surrender scenario with Mr. Levy, and that when the officer offered his hand to Mr. Levy took his hand, then leaned back and tried to pull the officer over the railing. And another officer grabbed that officer, preventing them from going over. In that case, the officer and Mr. Levy was saved. But because of that experience, this particular negotiator said, quote, "Beware of the dramatic ending." Knowing that information, we wanted to plan for an in-custody tactic that would keep the officers as safe as possible from risk of being grabbed and taken over the railing of Mr. Levy if indeed an in-custody involuntary commitment was going to have to take place. However, attempts to negotiate and to offer several surrender scenarios to Mr. Levy went on for 20 hours without response. At 4 a.m., Mr. Levy started to get dozy, and officers were concerned that he would fall asleep and fall off the bridge. So they were yelling at him, just trying to keep him awake. Early in the morning, Spokane Mental Health sent a mental health professional to the scene to serve as a consultant. Many of our public do not understand why we did not use a mental health professional to do the negotiations. The answer is simple. They will not do it. It is their policy that they will not negotiate in unsecured scenes, which this was. Therefore, they will only serve as a consultant. However, they did say, as part of their consultation, that the longer Mr. Levy goes, the higher risk it would be for him in terms of completing the suicide. Because the longer we went, he would become more paranoid without his medication, which made the likelihood to have to try to take him into involuntary custody even greater for us. By noon, our negotiators had been negotiating for about 17 hours. And some of them, the commander, for example, had already been on duty for 10 hours before the call out. They had to be relieved. The decision was made to relieve our negotiators, and we brought in the Spokane County negotiators. They continued to offer Mr. Levy several surrender options. As the day wore on, his risks increased, and another surrender plan was being proffered to him, but this time with a tactical backup to take him into involuntary commitment custody if he balked at the surrender plan. It was important to conduct the in-custody tactic inside of the portico because it removed him from the ledge. We knew he needed to urinate, so we convinced him to climb down and urinate in the portico so he could have some privacy from the cameras. The decision to use the taser was based on our knowledge that he was a jumper. He had jumped before. And the information that the other negotiator gave us that he had also almost been pulled over the railing when proffered his hand. The taser would allow the officers to bring him to the ground from a safe distance. During the incapacitation stage, the officers would have been able to keep him down and handcuff him for the involuntary commitment. In closing, I have offered to share all this information with Mr. Levy's father and aunt, and even more. I want us to remember that they tragically witnessed their loved one perish. I do hope for the healing for his family and for all who witnessed this tragic event. And lastly, I do feel for my officers, the officers of the Spokane Police Department, for the deputies of the Spokane County, the firefighters, and all of those who did give it their all to save Josh Levy. And may he rest in peace.